pick up a wine bottle and you see a vintage date on the label. Well, what the heck does that even mean? Well, I'm Nathan Dale, wine expert with ABC Fine Wine and Spirits.
And I'm Paul Quaglini, also a wine expert with ABC Fine Wine and Spirits.
And today we are talking about what is vintage and why does it matter. Dun, 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 dun.
So what actually is vintage? Vintage is nothing more than the year that the grapes were harvested, period. In the Northern Hemisphere, the wines are always typically harvested in the fall. In the Southern Hemisphere, because the seasons are flip-flopped, grapes are harvested in the spring. That's why the Southern Hemisphere wines, those from New Zealand, Argentina, Australia, are always a vintage ahead of those wines from the Northern Hemisphere.
Does vintage impact the flavor of the end product wine? The answer is absolutely yes. Things like drought, hail, very hot sun, rain, all of these will impact the growing portion of wine. So some years you might get hail. Hail has a huge impact on wine production. It might ruin the crop altogether. Frost can prevent the berries from even forming at all because it kills the buds before they're even ready to become grapes that turn into wine.
In the summertime, you could have severe heat spikes that cause drought and over-ripen the grapes.
Heavy rains can cause the fruit to become over full, over plump, and make washy wine without a lot of character or flavor. Too much sun literally can cause sunburn. So the vintage weather has such a huge impact. Remember, this is a Mother Nature, which is the weather, and human intervention, which is the winemaking. That together is the harmony that creates the liquid that we all love, which is wine. Does vintage actually matter? Before I answer that question, make sure to like, subscribe, and ring the notification bell, and leave some comments below.
The vintage can greatly impact the flavor of a wine, particularly if you're talking about areas of the world, Northern European wines, that don't get as much warmth and sunshine typically as New World wines like from California, Australia, where you have much more consistent sunshine.
In higher end wines, the variation in the weather patterns are going to create variation in the wine. It gives the winemaker something to work with. In really, really, really great vintages, yes, you'll have awesome wine across the board, but in harder vintages, a good winemaker that has to struggle a little bit, it's almost like a canvas, and their color palette is this difficult vintage, and they can play and create something beautiful.
Take, for example, 2016 vintage in Barolo. A fantastic vintage. You had wines with lots of power, lots of grace, almost perfect growing season across the board. 2017, on the other hand, was a much warmer vintage. So what does that mean for you as a consumer? The 17 vintage, while it's younger, is actually going to be more approachable because the wines are riper. Probably not as long-lived as the 16 vintage, but probably more enjoyable today than even the older wine.
On the other side of it, commercial wines, the vintage matters a little bit less because they're going for a house style.
They're looking at the acidity, they're looking at the alcohol, they're looking at a number of factors, and they try to replicate that year after year so that you have a consistent tasting wine every year.
Let's get nerdy for a second on vintage. In Europe, the vintage can actually have a legal impact on the final wine. So for instance, in Champagne, if the bottle of wine doesn't have a vintage on it, legally it has to be aged for 15 months before it can be released. That's the minimum. But if you put a vintage on the label, meaning it's wine from a specific year, it has to be a legal minimum of 36 months. And it can be as far as 10 years, depending on what kind of wine the winemaker or the house is trying to create. But that has a huge impact on the flavor of the wine. And with vintage champagnes, most houses don't make them every year. They make them in the years that warrant having the vintage designation, meaning the grapes are good enough to make vintage specific wine. And I love vintage champagne very, very much.
As a wine expert, I sometimes geek out over wine vintages, always trying to stay on top of what's the best vintage and what's happening in the wine world. As a regular consumer, you're probably not going to get that deep into it. There are plenty of places online where you can look at vintage charts or just ask for some help in our stores.
So now that you know what vintage is and why it's important, visit us online at abcfws.com or stop by one of our stores across the state of Florida. And check out our other videos.